Oskar Dirlewanger is a name that still evokes eerie feelings even among those familiar with the darkest pages of World War II. Commander of a battalion famous for its atrocities in the occupied territories, he has made killing, extreme sexual abuse and torture a daily practice. Though the brutality of Dirlewanger and his subordinates went beyond war crimes, it took on such proportions that even his fellow Nazi wards were shocked. Dirlewanger was one of the few Nazi commanders whose methods of torture were even disgusting to other members of the SS. His own comrades gave him a nickname, Bloodthirsty Butcher, and compared the unit to a gang of robbers and rapists. Oskar personally participated in torture and executions. He not only gave orders, but often tortured prisoners himself, deriving outright sadistic pleasure from this. Dirlewanger threw parties at which he entertained himself with sadistic shows. He forced captive girls to undress, dance, and then killed them while watching them suffer. And that's not a complete list of this man's crimes that you'll learn about in this episode. What kind of person could lead one of the most inhumane punitive squads in history of our kind? And why were his bloody deeds not only not stopped, but encouraged at the highest level? Oskar Dirlewanger's story is not just a story of cruelty. It is a story of the total darkness of the human soul, in which murder became pure entertainment and violence became an instrument of terror. Let's uncover one of the darkest pages in human history together. Time of Reich. The Third Reich was able to become a kind of springboard, because of which the bureaucratic and military elite could get such people to whom eminent German officers and politicians would not have shaken hands at other times. Suffice it to mention the first meeting between Hitler and the then president of Germany, Hindenburg. Eyewitnesses said that Paul von Hindenburg looked at the Bavarian corporal almost with contempt. But such was the time back then that the complete mediocrity suddenly became prominent politicians and military men, on whose activities thousands of human lives depended. One such character in German history in the 1930s and 1940s was Oskar Paul Dirlewanger. Prior to SS. A man was born into a wealthy Swabian family and was a surprisingly quiet and calm child. The childhood and youth of the future Punisher did not differ from the rest of the comrades in arms from fairly wealthy families. People who knew him personally would never have believed that this innocent child, who obediently attended Sunday church services with his parents, would grow up to be an adventurer of such caliber that there would be nowhere to test him. Although everything seemed to start well. Before entering the university in 1913, Dirlewanger went to serve in the army of Kaiser Wilhelm, did a year of service as a machine gunner, and received the rank of non-commissioned officer. In 1914, as we know, the First World War began, in which the future SS man took an active part, received 2 Iron Crosses, the rank of lieutenant, and the post of company commander. But at the same time, his primary predispositions of a marauder began to glow within him. Dirlewanger quickly realized that robbing civilians in wartime was a common thing, for which there would be no punishment whatsoever. So he thought he had to use the opportunity to the fullest. These skills were useful to him later, after the war ended. And after the World War I, Dirlewanger participated in the suppression of revolutionary uprisings in Germany in 1918-1919. Later, in a relatively short period of time, Dirlewanger changed a bunch of jobs. He was a tax advisor, a factory manager, and even a bank clerk. But he was always involved in stories of bribery and theft. It's astonishing how he could avoid prison, but the crook got off only with firings. At the same time, Oskar closely followed the political situation in the country, which was unstable. At one time, he was a member of the Freikorps, participated in street skirmishes that suppressed the pro-communist masses. At the same exact time, there was an internal strengthening of ultra-Nazi ideology. Another important thing to note, Dirlewanger despised all people's groups except the Germans, and he especially hated the Jewish. Of course, people felt that the time of great changes was approaching, and Oskar understood that it was necessary to have at least some baggage in order to have something to move forward with in life. From the commercial school where he studied for about 2 years, he was expelled again for anti-Semitism, but by some miracle he graduated from the University of Frankfurt am Main and even defended his doctoral degree. Also, he made attempts to join the ranks of the NSDAP party, which was gaining immense power. There, he was not immediately successful, but Dirlewanger knew how to wait. And yet, in 1933, when the party officially came to power, he achieved the post of head of the department. It was yet a small, but still a power that began to reveal the whole true character of the newly made Aryan. By old habit, Oskar managed to get into all kinds of scandals about bribery and theft here. Plus, there was also frequent abuse based off of his status. Progress was evident in other aspects as well. Suddenly, Dirlewanger discovered a passion for debauchery with minors and got into the habit of having fun with 13-year-old girls. And this time, he did not manage to wriggle out as he usually did. Caught red-handed, the pedophile was thrown out of the party, along the way stripped of all previously received titles and awards, and even the prison cell did not pass him by. It was an utterly strong blow. That's where the connections came in handy and friendship with the right individuals. After 2 years, the libertine was released from prison and sent to fight in Spain for General Franco as part of the volunteer military unit Condor. In Spain, he distinguished himself for war crimes again, and on his return in 1939, Dirlewanger was reinstated in the Nazi Party, in the SS, and awarded the rank of Untersturmführer. From this moment on, the history of the most brutal punitive unit of the SS begins. Waffen-SS. Despite the official decent biography, the highest ranks of the Third Reich were well aware of the moral poverty within Dirlewanger. But they were guided by this simple formula: personnel decide everything. So they kept Oskar nearby, realizing that he could be useful in the future. And soon the opportunity to show himself in all his glory presented itself to him. Obviously, preparation for war required the mobilization of a huge number of people. The German command realized that it was necessary to use all possible resources, so it decided to create several penal battalions formed from former and present convicts. Dirlewanger's patron, the head of the SS mine office, Himmler's deputy, Gottlob Berger, convinced his boss of the need to create a special penal team in the ranks of the SS. This is where Dirlewanger's criminal experience was needed. He is instructed to create a team of criminals, mainly hunters convinced of poaching. However, later, professional criminals began to get into the team, such as murderers as well as robbers. In 1940, a penal unit of 84 thugs appeared in the structure of the SS, numbering about a company. The Dirlewanger Sonderkommando, consisting of criminals, poachers, and downright sadists, was originally formed as an elite punitive group to suppress uprisings and fight partisans. But despite everything, due to their lack of discipline and brutal treatment of anyone they came across, the group quickly turned into a gang that went beyond conventional military operations. Even by Nazi standards, which were not known for their humane treatment of civilians, Dirlewanger's Sonderkommando was utterly ruthless and disregarded for the laws of war. Subsequently, the Sniper, or as it was called, the Oranienburg Hunting Company, began to recruit soldiers of the Wehrmacht and SS troops who had committed a prominent mistake. Additionally, Dirlewanger was allowed to accept into his unit not only representatives of the Aryan race and the so-called Volksdeutsche, Germans born and living outside of Germany, but also representatives of other peoples. Oskar accepted the command with great zeal. In the same ranks as the elite criminals, he felt like a fish in water, creating one of the most ruthless and fearsome divisions that would make a horrendous mark during the war. It is unknown why exactly, but Dirlewanger was alien to human feelings from the beginning of military career. Many years of hardening from committing numerous crimes himself turned him into a real monster. He experienced real pleasure when children and women were tortured in his presence, and with sincere joy he watched the burning of villages with the inhabitants inside of them being surrounded. The scoundrels who served under him adored him for not binding them to any moral principles, allowing pretty much any atrocities. It's impossible to convey what the Nazi troops did there. Villages were burned to the ground. The population was exterminated completely. Girls and women were raped. But to the Third Reich, these were not crimes, but rather victories. So in 1942, Dirlewanger was awarded the title of Oberführer and Governor General. Not sparing his opponents, the man did not spare his own soldiers, knowing that the detachments would be constantly replenished, since there was no shortage of prisoners in Germany. He threw his soldiers into machine guns without any mercy, even if the victory was in no way proportionate with the losses. But again, for the marginals who lived one day at a time, this was not considered some kind of crime against them by themselves. Most importantly, he allowed them to kill and rob without any remorse. Crimes. What did Dirlewanger's Sonderkommando do? This, in fact, punitive and terrorist group was supposed to firstly track down and destroy, as far as possible, partisan detachments or counteract larger partisan formations. Secondly, to carry out merciless punitive actions, or to engage in genocide of the population of the occupied territories. The latter, the Punishers did much better, although they also caused problems for the partisans. Dirlewanger's Punishers specialized in the use of the most brutal methods. Their main tactic was to exterminate the civilian population in retaliation for supporting the guerrillas. These actions brought an insane level of fear and horror to the occupied territories. Particularly barbaric was the approach to the destruction of entire villages and towns, where the Dirlewanger troops killed locals on the slightest suspicion of collaborating with the resistance. In its essence, every person in these territories was a potential victim, even if they were completely innocent. Such actions were often accompanied by mass torture to extract at least some information, and then murders, regardless of whether the person was involved in guerrilla activity or not. The prime time of their punitive actions, the Dirlewangerites, was noted in Poland, starting in 1940. Here, they had to guard the perimeters of the ghetto, escort prisoners and arrested civilians to be sent to concentration camps. It was on the prisoners of the fascist concentration camps that the battalion's Punishers trained, honing their terrific skills. Dirlewanger's Sonderkommando used concentration camp inmates as training targets for its soldiers. People were brutally tortured and executed so that soldiers could hone their skills and get used to acts of violence as the norm. This practice became a kind of school for the soldiers of the battalion, where violence became routine. Such practices were unofficially approved at the highest level, as it was believed that they contributed to the hardening of fighters. At the same time, the Dirlewangerites were also involved in the fight against the Polish insurgents. The peculiarity of this criminal swarm in SS uniforms was that they didn't leave prisoners. The prisoners were first mocked, and then all were killed. Dirlewanger's followers committed particularly barbaric actions against captured partisans. Any clash with the partisans ended in brutal reprisals. Many POWs were subjected to monstrous torture before they were executed. Sometimes, for intimidation, the Dirlewanger's people organized public executions, in which they forced local residents to watch the brutal reprisals against the partisans. This was part of their psychology of terror. They sought not only to physically destroy the enemy, but also to morally break the local population. The merits of these cruel people were appreciated by the chief of police of the Lublin district, a certain Globocnik. He sent telegrams of praise to the Reich SS Kanzlei concerning Dirlewanger. Meanwhile, many German officers of the Wehrmacht and even of some SS services and units considered the Dirlewangerites to be bloodthirsty butchers, looters, and robbers, which was indeed true. The soldiers from this gang behaved exactly like criminals who came from prison and were allowed to do whatever they wished. They killed, they raped, robbed, and even for no reason. The commander turned a blind eye to the antics of his subordinates, since he himself could give odds to any of them in atrocious deeds. For example, Oskar Dirlewanger arranged once in his apartment a drinking party for subordinate officers, as well as officers of the local SD and SS. At his command, 10 Jewish women were brought in. Dirlewanger forced the unfortunates to strip naked and dance to the music. At the same time, they were whipped with belts, insulted and mocked in every possible way. When the host and guests got tired of such ruthless entertainment, Dirlewanger personally killed all the girls, injecting them with the strychnine. The whole company, with pleasure, watched the agonizing death of the poor young women. This case became a symbol of the cruelty and absolute impunity enjoyed by Dirlewanger and his subordinates. Atrocious acts such as this were not uncommon in the practices of the Sonderkommando. Numerous testimonies confirm that such entertainments were organized regularly, as if human lives had no value. Dirlewanger and his team killed without the slightest hesitation, guided only by their sadistic pleasure. Even among the Nazis known for their cruelty, Dirlewanger stood out for his special degree of inhumane approach and the absence of any moral restrictions. His reputation reached the highest echelons of the SS, but instead of being punished, he continued to receive promotions and awards, which only increased his sense of permissiveness. When the SS leaders began to receive numerous letters and complaints from the Germans themselves and even the SS about Dirlewanger's activities, the SS leadership sent an inspector to verify the complaints, SS Untersturmführer Georg Konrad Morgen. Morgan described all the shameful deeds of Dirlewanger. In reality, emphasis was placed on communication with racially inferior women and looting. And at the end of his report, he proposed that Dirlewanger himself be arrested and his unit disbanded. But the elites of the SS and the Nazi Party decided in their own way. Dirlewanger was promoted to the rank of the SS Hauptsturmführer, or captain, and the battalion was transferred to the east, to Belarus. And there he was engaged in the protection of the Mogilev ghetto, and at the same time he was involved in the fight against partisans. During the Second World War, the Dirlewanger group took an active part in many operations against partisan detachments and formations. The experience of poachers hunters, this punitive unit, turned out to be very useful in this type of actions. Snipers and scouts of the battalion tracked down and found partisan paths, set up sniper ambushes. In a word, they harmed as many as they could, and created truly a lot of problems for local partisans. And after the fighting, the group carried out merciless, punitive operations against the civilian population. According to the investigation, the Dirlewanger battalion accounts for more than 180 burned villages. In most of them, the inhabitants were partially or entirely destroyed. Usually, the Punishers drove the inhabitants into the local club or stable, poured kerosene onto the walls and, propping up the entrance doors, set them on fire. Flamethrowers were also used, but sometimes for entertainment, the doors were left unpropped. When people in panic, mainly women and children, began to crowd on the doors, trying to jump out of the fire bag because of agonizing burning, the Punishers, laughing, shot them with machine guns. Before burning, the Dirlewanger followers could arrange tortures for those who were suspected of collaborating with the partisans. People were beaten with feet, sticks, whips, or rifle butts. They could be pierced with pitchforks or cut with rifle bayonets, so that the cuts were not very deep, but there were many of them. Another favorite pastime of the executioners was hanging people. They could be hung by the legs or by the arms, for one arm or a leg, and of course by the neck. In a word, here too, these troops showed their sadistic ingenuity. The number of victims of the most ruthless SS battalion grew, and at the same time, the ranks of their commander, Dirlewanger, grew. In 1941, he was already SS Sturmbannführer, or mayor. In 1942, Obersturmbannführer, lieutenant colonel, and in 1943, SS Standartenführer, colonel. The Nazi leadership did not forget about the words of their sadistic hero, Iron Cross, Silver Cross, and others. Relations within the battalion were twofold. On the one hand, it seemed to be a military unit from the official point of view, but with a detail, a gang of criminals. Discipline in the unit was extraordinarily strict. For the slightest offense, an employee could be beaten with sticks, put for several days in a punishment cell or in a pit, depending on the location and situation, or even killed. It was the only military unit among the SS divisions where a commander could shoot a subordinate without trial, and, well, Dirlewanger, this man got away with everything. The methods used by the battalion in the fight against partisans and the suppression of urban uprisings were the most brutal. The Punishers created human shields from civilians, under the cover of which the Dirlewangerites could safely approach the enemy. This was a common practice for the SS. In the same way, they checked the presence or absence of partisan mines on roads and paths. They sent local residents to suspicious areas where mines could be placed, and if someone refused to make a step there, then this person was shot. These are lines from official reports that were not burned by Nazis at the end of war, and therefore the traces of their crimes were preserved in these documents. One partisan and 286 accomplices were shot. 2 partisans and 176 suspects were shot. The end of Dirlewanger. At the end of 1943, the German command had to plug the holes with everything they could. So, Oskar Dirlewanger was on the front line, though not for long. The Punishers were good at fighting partisans and conducting punitive raids in the rear. Finding itself in an unusual situation at the front itself, the battalion began to suffer heavy losses. In a few weeks of fighting by January 1944, Dirlewanger had lost half of his personnel. As a result of these losses, the German command was forced to withdraw the battalion from the front and return to its habitual sadistic occupations, war with the local population. Dirlewanger, along with all the rear services, began to roll back to the western part of Europe, leaving a trail of blood in its wake. On 1st of August 1944, an uprising began in Warsaw. The Sonder battalion turned into the Dirlewanger brigade, numbering about 1,000 soldiers, which was transferred to the Polish capital to suppress the uprising. In Warsaw, the ranks of the brigade were replenished with SS and Wehrmacht penal prisoners. The number of personnel increased to 2,500. In suppressing the uprising, Dirlewanger used the usual methods: hostage-taking, human shields of residents, executions of prisoners and hanging, burning houses with insurgents, burning hospitals with the sick and disabled inside of them, killing wounded and medical personnel. As a result, the advance of the Sonderkommando was the fastest and most successful, but the losses were also heavy, more than half of the brigade's personnel. The commander himself, for distinguished service in suppressing the uprising, received the Knight's Cross and the rank of Oberführer. Having replenished its ranks with another batch of penal prisoners and convicts, the unit went to Slovakia, where the uprising also began. In Slovakia, the brigade once again fully justified the trust of the SS top leadership, acting in the same exact way as in Belarus and Warsaw: hostages, ambushes, human shields, provocations, and terror of the civilian population. But the war, as any war, was coming to an end. Hitler's Germany was living out its last months, and casualties just increased. By order of February 14, 1945, the Dirlewanger Brigade was transformed into the 36th SS Grenadier Division. The order caught the punitive forces in Hungary, where heavy fighting was taking place. Only a day after the order, Dirlewanger himself was seriously wounded and went to the hospital for treatment. He never returned to his division. Fritz Schmedes, who had previously commanded the 4th SS Police Division, was appointed acting commander of the division. The newly formed division, together with the remnants of the German group of troops defeated in Hungary, retreated to Silesia. Then, the former Dirlewangerites defended the lines on the outskirts of Berlin itself. As for their commander, the chief executioner himself was detained by a French patrol in the city of Althausen. He tried his best to impersonate someone else, but one Jewish man, a former prisoner of a concentration camp which was liberated, identified him. Dirlewanger was put in the city prison. The fact is that many Poles served in the French troops. They also served as the prison guards. The Poles knew what kind of bird had fallen into their hands. Therefore, in violation of the regulations and norms, every day, the convoy arranged an execution for the man. The body of the Punisher could not withstand it. After another beating, Oskar Dirlewanger died. It is X War History. Subscribe to the channel and support our work. Let the history not be forgotten.